Hello, I am Dr. Jim Hardt from the Biocybernaut Institute, and I'm going to talk about an aspect of consciousness which is important to everyone, and that is their IQ, their intelligence. And I welcome you here to this presentation at the Global Consciousness Summit 1.0. And what I'm going to share with you are some of the scientific details of a study done that demonstrated 1 week of the Biocybernaut Alpha training produced an increase in IQ averaging 11.7 points, and the benefits were unchanged out to at least a year. Now, we don't know what happened after that because we didn't measure, but this is an IQ boost that lasts for at least a year. The topics of the presentation here are, first of all, an introduction and a context for this research, a description of the study of alpha and IQ, a description of the neurofeedback. We recorded 8 channels of EEG and did feedback on 4 of them, give you an overview, talk about the protocols and the data collection, then discuss the analysis methods, then results, starting with a sneak preview, a discussion and questions, and then the implications and opportunities. The Biocybernaut Institute was first founded on America's bicentennial, the 4th of July, 1776. I reorganized it on December 5th of 1983 as the Biocybernaut Institute. And a biocybernaut is to inner space what an astronaut is to outer space. Someone who goes on an adventure. Here's some of the context. In 1976, I showed Zen EEG changes with Zen meditation, changed the brainwaves, did this with 6-channel power and coherence analysis. In 1977, I demonstrated that alpha training at Biocybernaut reduced anxiety. In 1978, I showed that alpha training could reduce schizophrenia, psychasthenia, and paranoia with implications for specific head sites. For example, paranoia is only reduced by alpha increases at C3, whereas schizophrenia and psychasthenia are reduced by alpha increases at the occipitals, O1 and O2. In 1987, I would change the format of the training from a one-on-one to a group training where up to 5 people could train in one group. Everyone would have their own chamber, of course, to do the neurofeedback work. In 1991, I showed that there were brainwave correlates, EEG correlates of advanced spiritual states. In 1993, I showed that your increase in creativity could be 50% in just a week with the Biocybernaut Alpha training. Also in 1993, I showed that 1 week, 7 days of the Biocybernaut Alpha training could produce the same brainwave changes as seen in advanced Zen, which takes, in Japan, the way they do it, 21 to 40 years. In 1994, I was able to show how human moods could be convolved with the brainwaves to actually make predictions about what brainwaves you would have to change in order to assume whatever mood state you wanted to assume. In 2000, I showed that there were IQ increases, averaging 11.7 points that attended to the Biocybernaut 1-week alpha training program. 2006, I expanded to Canada and opened a center there. In 2009, I expanded to Germany and opened a center in southern Bavaria. And in 2011, I expanded to Sedona, Arizona, where I am now in the world headquarters of Biocybernaut. In 2012, I spoke at the UN in Geneva about work with Canadian Aboriginals. We trained over 200 of them. Also in 2012, I showed that the Biocybernaut Alpha training would reduce a wide range of psychopathologies in a cohort of male and female Canadian Aboriginals. And this was interesting because these people, because of the discrimination, the racism that they've experienced, and the residential school system, are, as a people, perhaps as profoundly post-traumatic stress disordered as returning war veterans. In 2016, I showed the graphs, brainwave graphs associated with Advanced Zen at the Voice and Exit Conference. In 2017, I showed the social and economic impact on whole communities. What we were able to do was the scholarship sponsor for the 200 Canadian Aboriginals was getting information that the people who did the training and went back to their reservations were causing beneficial effects in the people they interacted with. And he asked me to design a study to demonstrate this. And so we did. And we surveyed family members, friendship networks, and co-workers for those that had jobs. And we confirmed that there were both social and economic impacts on whole communities from a few people coming and doing the Biocybernaut Alpha training. And so we say the Biocybernaut Alpha training is protagious. That's the positive side of contagious. Higher consciousness gets on you if you happen to be near someone who has higher consciousness. In 2017, I showed that the 50% boost in creativity lasts for at least a year. It's the main topic that we'll be going into today. And also in 2017, I showed that there was a big increase of emotional intelligence from the Biocybernaut Alpha training. Now, we have here a book by Dr. Travis Bradbury and Janine Greaves called Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And in there, they say that emotional intelligence accounts for almost 60% of your success in life. Actually 58%. Whereas they also say that your IQ accounts for only maybe 10 or 15%. You could be very, very smart, but if you can't get along with people, you can't hold a job, or you can't have employees, or you can't recruit investors because you can't be nice to them. You don't have enough emotional intelligence. So today we're going to talk about EQ. And then I do recommend that you check out the Emotional Intelligence book by Dr. Travis Bradbury and Janine Greaves. In 2019, addressing the global interest in mindfulness, I showed that brainwave feedback is perhaps the best method to achieve mindfulness, certainly faster and more reliable, and you get feedback. Earlier this year, I spoke at SIMA's, Her Holiness SIMA's International Summit on the Evolution of the New Human. Also, Recovery Radio in Vancouver, we spoke about addiction recovery with the Biocybernaut Alpha training. And here we are in late 2020 at the Global Consciousness Summit 1.0. And I'm also going to be speaking about the cartography of consciousness. But for now, let's go into increases in IQ in both children and adults. Here's a simple description of the study. We did IQ testing, pre and post, using the Kaufman Adolescent and Adult Intelligence Test. It takes 4 hours to administer. All the sections have to be carefully timed with a stopwatch, and you can only do it for one person at a time, so it's very labor intensive. Then all of the people who had been pre-tested did the Biocybernaut 7-day intensive alpha training, and there was a control group that simply waited, didn't do any training. And afterwards, there was IQ testing, the post-test IQ. What we did was we gave neurofeedback with 4 channels of EEG feedback. We recorded at 8 sites bilateral occipital, that's O1 and O2, bilateral central, C3 and C4. T3 and T4 were the temporals, F3 and F4 were the frontals. And the feedback, which it was audio feedback, and every 2 minutes people saw numerical scores, were at 4 of those 8 channels, O1, O2, occipital, C3, C4, central. And the data collection included integrated amplitude scores and the hemicoherent scores between channel pairs, left and right brainwaves. We recorded delta, slow and fast theta, slow alpha, broadband alpha, fast alpha, slow beta, and broadband beta. Presently, we're doing twice that number of recordings, 8 channels then and 16 channels now. And we include, of course, gamma and Schumann brainwaves. The IQ assessment was with the Kaufman Adolescent and Intelligence Test, and there are 2 main dimensions, the crystallized and the fluid, and they sum up to make the composite IQ. And when I say there was an average increase of 11.7 points, that was with the composite IQ. And there, of course, there are multiple subscales for the crystallized IQ and the fluid IQ. Crystallized is like verbal intelligence, and the fluid is like mathematical and logical intelligence. Here's an example of the test form, and then here are some of the places that under the, we have definitions, rebus learning, logical steps, auditory comprehension, mystery codes, double meanings, rebus, delayed recall, auditory delayed recall, memory block designs, and famous faces. And you can check this out further if you want, but we have the analysis method included t-statistics for 2 means with unequal ends, and then we did paired t-statistics for a set of paired observation, and we also did product moment correlation coefficients, known as R. The IQ increases in adults, here's a sneak preview of the results, very highly significant. The paired t-tests of the post versus the pre-scores showed that the alpha subjects increased their composite IQ, that's the composite of both the verbal and the mathematical logical, by an average of 11.7 points. And you can see the probability very, very highly significant, p less than 0.000000021. And so we're looking at a very strong effect here. Now, changes in IQ scores, significant changes in all dimensions. The crystallized IQ, which is the verbal, had a maximum increase of 39 points. Can you imagine what you would be like if your verbal IQ went up 39 points? Fluid IQ, the maximum increase was 23 points, and the composite IQ, the maximum increase was 19 points. The strongest effects were on boosting analytic and pattern recognition abilities. There were large increases in all dimensions. The percentile rank of crystallized IQ, the maximum increase was 29%. The percentile rank of the fluid IQ, the maximum increase was 49%, that's whopping. And the percentile rank of composite IQs, the maximum increase was 39. Remember, crystallized is like a verbal, fluid is mathematical logical, and composite is sort of the sum of the 2. The largest increases in percentile rank of crystallized IQ, the percentile rank of crystallized IQ average increase was 10.7%. As you can see there, the probability p less than 0.0015 is highly significant. Large increases in percentile rank of fluid IQ, average increase of 15.3 points, 0.0005, highly significant. The percentile rank of composite IQs, the average increase was 13%, and it was highly significant. Now, that's the end of the sneak preview. Now, the detailed results follow. This is going to be a scientific presentation, and you might want to take notes. The results. The t-statistics for 2 means with unequal ends, and the paired t-statistic for a set of paired observations, and we also used the product moment correlation coefficient. First thing we wanted to look at was chronological age. Was there any difference in this effect, the Biocybernaut alpha training? Did it have any effect of with chronological age in raising IQ? And we can see that the control subjects were significantly older P less than 0.05 than the alpha training subjects, 46.4 years versus 32 years. Elapsed time between the pre and the post testing. Control subjects, there was not significant. The control subjects, we had about 105 days between pre and post, and in the alpha subjects, it was about 120 days. Pre-IQ scores. The control subjects averaged 111 as their IQ, and the alpha subjects pre averaged 114, and this difference was not significant. So the groups, the control subjects and the alpha groups were well matched. They did not differ in initial IQ. The control subjects and the alpha subjects also did not differ in the crystallized definitions subtest. The control subjects and the alpha subjects did not differ in the crystallized auditory comprehension. So again, they're well matched. The crystallized double meaning subtest. Again, the control subjects and the alpha subjects were exactly the same scores. So the difference was certainly not significant. The pre-IQ scores, the fluid IQ scores of control subjects did not differ significantly from the alpha subjects. The pre-IQ fluid rebus learning subtest, again, the control and the alpha subjects did not differ significantly. The pre-IQ scores on the fluid logical steps subtest, the control subjects and the alpha subjects did not differ significantly. And so what we're seeing is a pattern of the alpha subjects and the control subjects were extremely well matched. The groups didn't differ before training, before the alpha training. And so here we see the fluid mystery code subtest. Again, no significant difference. And then we look at the IQ, the composite IQ of the control subjects and the alpha subjects was not significantly different. Then a summary of the pre-IQ test. Everything, not just a few scores, not just many scores, but all of the scores are not significantly different when comparing the controls with the alpha subject. This means the subjects are well matched. The control subjects are well matched to the ones who did the alpha training. Now, we also want to look at the post-IQ t-test. Here what we see is that the IQ scores for crystallized IQ on the control subjects and the alpha subjects, big difference on the alpha subjects, 125 versus 112. Difference was not significant. Of course, they started in different places. IQ scores crystallized, definition subtest, not significant between control and alpha subjects. Post-IQ, the crystallized auditory comprehension. Now here we come to a difference between the control subjects and the alpha subjects. Let's go back to look at the crystallized IQ, okay? Now, what is crystallized IQ? It is basically your verbal IQ. And 4 of the 6 subscales of the verbal IQ were things that related to your vocabulary. For example, like if I give you a syllogism, like tree is to apple as cow is to, and then I give you choices like banana, milk, and butter, or no, that wouldn't work. Cow is to apple, peanut, and milk. So tree is to apple as cow is to apple, peanut, or milk. And of course, you would pick milk because tree is to apple as cow is to milk. But if you didn't know any of those words or any one of those words, because it wasn't in your vocabulary, you might be very smart, but you didn't have that IQ, you didn't have that vocabulary word, and so you would not be able to solve that. And so there's nothing about the alpha training that would suggest that if you didn't know a word before the alpha training, that you would know that word 7 days later. However, there are 2 subscales on the verbal IQ test. that were hugely significant. Overall, we don't see the significance. And so, like with definitions, people don't know word definitions more a week after alpha training than they do before. It's not a vocabulary training. But if we're talking about auditory comprehension, there we see a highly significant difference. The control subjects, 10.5, alpha subjects, 14.7. And what this means is that when the alpha subjects listened to a story or a conversation after the alpha training, they understood it better. So the alpha training increased people's auditory comprehension. There was no gain in the control subjects. Then when we look at the double meanings, which is also vocabulary based, there was no significant effect. People aren't likely to know vocabulary better at the end of 7 days of alpha training than they did before. And then so we have a summary of the crystallized IQ after the alpha training. There was improved auditory comprehension. There were no vocabulary changes, but there was better listening, more understanding, and more accurate recall. Now, imagine how much better your life would be if you could listen better, you could understand better what you heard, and you had more accurate recall. And so these are results of the Biocybernaut Alpha 1 training. Then look at the post-IQ scores, t-tests based on the fluid IQ. Okay, so here we have the fluid IQ, where we have control subjects and alpha subjects, and this was highly significant, the whole fluid dimension, which is mathematical and logical. Now, there were subscales within this, but unlike the auditory, where there are only 2 subscales related to auditory comprehension that increased, vocabulary didn't change. There were no improvements in your vocabulary from doing the alpha training, but your mathematical and logical abilities go up pretty dramatically. It's highly significant. The probability that this result could have occurred by chance is less than p less than 0.0019, 19 10,000s. So very unlikely. So it's a strong effect. Now we look at one of the subscales on the fluid IQ, the rebus learning. That was not significant. But we look at the logical steps, and this was highly significant. You can see the big difference between the control subjects and the alpha subjects. Mystery codes on the fluid IQ, that was also highly significantly different between the control subjects and the alpha subjects, where it had not been different before. And then a summary of the fluid IQ after the alpha training. There's improved analysis and deduction. There is better analytic ability, better reasoning, and better pattern recognition. So in 1 week of the Biocybernaut Alpha training, people were able to improve their analytic ability, their reasoning ability, and their pattern recognition abilities. Okay, now let's look at the composite IQ. The control subjects and the alpha subjects differed strongly, highly significantly, p less than 0.01. And this is the composite now, remember, includes both the mathematical logical, which is called fluid, and the verbal, which is called crystallized. And so here's a summary of the post-IQ results. In spite of no differences between the control group and the experimental group, there were many significant differences in the post-IQ. The auditory comprehension subscale of the crystallized IQs were higher in the alpha subjects, and the fluid IQs were higher in the alpha subjects, and the composite IQs were higher in the alpha subjects. Now, there's another aspect of the auditory comprehension, which is a subscale, which is called delayed auditory comprehension. And in this, 4 hours after they took they looked at the or listened to the recordings the tape-recorded sort of news stories or conversation, which were the subject of the auditory comprehension test. 4 hours later, the subjects were asked new questions that had not been asked before to test how well their auditory comprehension lasted. And so there were also significant improvements in the delayed auditory recall. So after alpha training, people had better auditory comprehension, but they also had better memory of those auditory conversations. And 4 hours later, they were able to perform better than the control subjects. And so here's a summary of the post-IQ results. Many significant differences. There was improved auditory comprehension, no vocabulary changes, but there was better listening, there was more understanding, and there was more accurate recall 4 hours later. In the mathematical logical, there was improved analysis and deduction, there was better analytic ability, there was better reasoning, and there was better pattern recognition. Okay, now let's look at changes in the IQ using t-test, using the crystallized IQ. Control subjects, now we're looking at changes, a significant difference between control subjects and the alpha subjects. So if we're looking at the changes, even in the basic 6 subscale crystallized IQ, and that includes the definitions, there were significant changes in the alpha subjects that were not seen in the control subjects. The changes in IQ, crystallized IQ definitions, there were no changes. People didn't do better at word definitions after than before. A week is, that where you're not learning words is not going to do anything to improve your definition ability. Crystallized IQ auditory comprehension, it was significant in favor of the alpha subjects. Crystallized IQ double meanings, the changes were not significant between control and alpha. And so here's a summary of the crystallized IQ after the alpha training. There was improved auditory comprehension, no change in vocabulary, but there was better listening, more understanding, and more accurate recall. Now, changes in the IQ using t-test with the fluid IQ. Overall, the changes in the fluid IQ, which is mathematical and logical abilities, improved in the alpha subgroup. The difference was highly significant. Rebus learning was not significant. Logical steps on the subscales of the mathematical logical was highly significant. Mystery codes in the alpha subjects were significantly better than the control subjects. And so a summary of the fluid IQ after the alpha training was there's improved analysis and deduction, there's better analytic ability, there's better reasoning, and there's better pattern recognition. So 1 week of alpha training gives you better analytic ability, better reasoning skills, and better pattern recognition abilities. Now let's look at the composite IQ. Looking at changes in the composite IQ, there was a highly significant difference in the changes in the control subjects versus changes in the alpha subjects. The changes in IQ, there was significant changes in all dimensions. Crystallized, which is crystallized is the verbal IQ. Fluid is the mathematical logical, and the composite is both of them. There are stronger effects on boosting analytic and pattern recognition abilities because the crystallized has 4 of the 6 subscales relating to things that require vocabulary. And the alpha training does not significantly change your vocabulary in 1 week. Then let's look at the crystallized. The changes in IQ, the alpha subjects from pre to post, that's what we're going to look at. On the crystallized IQ, the alpha subjects pre to post, highly significant increase, very powerful. On the crystallized IQ definitions, alpha subjects, highly significant increase. Not big increase, but it's highly significant. And in the crystallized auditory comprehension, highly significant increase for the alpha subjects. Crystallized IQ double meanings, significant increase for the alpha subjects. And the summary of the crystallized IQ after alpha training is there's improved auditory comprehension, no change in vocabulary, but better listening, more understanding, and more accurate recall. Now let's look at the fluid. Look at that, very highly significant. This is for the changes in the fluid IQ score from before to after with the alpha training. P less than 0.000053. Incredibly powerful result. So the alpha training boosted the fluid IQ, which is mathematical and logical abilities, in the people who did the Biocybernaut alpha training. And if we look at the rebus learning, which is one of the subscales, subtests, it was highly significant increase for the alpha subjects. The logical steps increase was highly significant for the alpha subjects. The mystery codes subscale, highly significant increase for the alpha subjects. And a summary of the fluid IQ after the alpha training is there's improved analysis and deduction. There's better analytic ability, better reasoning, and better pattern recognition. Okay, now let's look at the composite IQ. The alpha subjects, the average increase was 11.7 points. And this is very, very highly significant result. The Biocybernaut alpha training, very, very highly significantly increased IQ, overall IQ, this is both the mathematical, logical, and the verbal components, from pre to post their 7-day alpha 1 training. Changes in IQ scores. So we see significant changes in all dimensions. Crystallized IQ, which is verbal, had a maximum increase of 39 IQ points. The fluid IQ had a maximum increase, which is the mathematical logical, had a maximum increase of 23 IQ points. And the composite IQ, the maximum increase was 19 points. Remember, the average was 11.7. So there were large increases in all dimensions. The percentile rank of crystallized IQ increased maximum 29%. Percentile rank of the fluid IQ, the maximum increase was 49%. Can you imagine somebody increasing their mathematical logical IQ by 49% in just 1 week? And of course, as we'll soon see, these results are stable at least a year out. And the percentile rank of the composite IQ, which is the overall, combines the mathematical, logical, and the verbal, that maximum increase was 33%. There were large increases in percentile rank of crystallized IQ scores of the alpha subjects. The average increase in percentile rank was 10.7%, and this is highly significant. There were large increases in percentile rank of fluid IQ in the alpha subject. The average increase was 15.3 points, and this is highly significant. Look at that, P less than 0.0005. Less than 5 chances in 10,000 that this result could have occurred, random chance. And then large increases in percentile rank in the alpha subjects of the composite IQ, 13%. Again, the result is highly significant. Now here we look at correlations with age. It turns out that the crystallized IQ change with chronological age was not significant. So there were in the study children as young as, I believe, 10, and the most senior person was 64. And so the Biocybernaut alpha training increased IQ regardless of age. From 10 to 64, there was no difference. So this method is effective in boosting your IQ. Doesn't matter what age you are, 10, 12, 15, 30, 50, 60, 64. There's no effect with age. This works for everyone, which is really beautiful. All right, it changes in IQ, the crystallized IQ definitions, alpha subjects only. no correlations with age. Looking at the crystallized IQ, auditory comprehension, no correlations with age. Double meanings, no correlation with age. And so what we see is that the Biocybernaut Alpha training produces boosts in IQ that are unrelated to the age of the person. You could be 10 or you could be 64 or anywhere in between, and it works equally beneficially regardless of your age. There is no correlation of change of crystallized IQ as a function of chronological age. Now let's look at the fluid IQ. Okay, the overall fluid IQ, which is mathematical logical, no correlation with age. Looking at the subscale, rebus learning, no correlation with age. Looking at logical steps, no correlation with age. Mystery codes, no correlation with age. And so what we see also, as in the crystallized IQ, which is the verbal logical, which is the vocabulary-based verbal IQ, had no age-related correlations. And then we see here with the fluid IQ, which is mathematical and logical. Similarly, there are no age-related correlations. So, but the main mathematical logical, which is the fluid IQ scale, it doesn't correlate with age, and none of the subscales correlate with age. So the IQ boosting effects of the Biocybernaut Alpha training in both verbal IQ and mathematical and logical IQ are unrelated to age. This works for everyone, which is absolutely wonderful. All right, correlations of IQ change with age. In the composite, this is the overall, looking at the overall IQ, combining mathematical, logical, and the verbal IQ. No change, no effect related to age. All right, so the summary is, looking at the composite IQ, the changes with alpha training were unrelated to age. There were no correlations of change in composite IQ as a function of chronological age. So now, one of the reasons that this may be is that the Biocybernaut Alpha training reverses age-related changes in the brain. It turns out that when atherosclerosis sets in, which depending on your diet, your genetics, or your lifestyle, could be as early as your 20s, even early 20s. Once that happens, the frequency of your alpha starts to slow, which is not a good thing. Normally, alpha is brainwave frequencies between 8 and 13 cycles per second. Most people center around 10. And so the slowing, once hardening of the arteries, atherosclerosis begins, is 0.8 hertz per decade. 0.8 of a hertz for every 10 years of life. So if you center around 10, like most people do, in a little more than 2 decades, you've lost your alpha. It's dropped off below 8 cycles per second, and then you enter senescence and senility, and death often soon follows. So the Biocybernaut Alpha training can reverse this age-related change in the brainwaves. And so the reason that there may be no age-related changes in any of the IQ scales, not the verbal, not the mathematical, logical, and not any of their subscales, could be because the Biocybernaut Alpha training reversed these age-related changes of all the people who did the Biocybernaut Alpha training. And so we have an interesting mystery here as to why there are no age-related changes in IQ with the Biocybernaut Alpha training. And the simple, easy answer is the Biocybernaut Alpha training reverses age-related changes in the brainwaves. And so 10 and 15 and 20-year-olds changes in increased IQ are the same as you see in 30s and 40s and 50s and even 60-year-old people. Very good thing. No correlations of change in composite IQ as a function of chronological age. Now let's look at correlations of EQ changes with elapsed time, because there were different time differences between when people first took the IQ test before their alpha training and when they took it later. And so this was a way for us to see if the IQ boosts tended to fade over time. If the IQ boost did fade over time, then there would be a correlation of the change of IQ as a result of the alpha training with time. And so people who did their second IQ test later would show smaller gains from their alpha training if there were a reduction in this IQ boost that occurred over time. So let's see what happened. All right. IQ change correlated with elapsed time for the alpha subjects. That's what we're doing. And look at that. Not significant. This is for the crystallized IQ. This is the verbal IQ. There was, in the alpha subjects, we measured the crystallized IQ before and after, and some so that we could test the sensitivity of the gains that we were anticipating to factors such as time. We had people take their second IQ test quickly, with some delay, or even out to a year. And what we found was no significant correlation of the benefit, retained benefit of the alpha subjects as a function of how long after their alpha training they were tested. And the same thing is true with the crystallized IQ. This was the crystallized IQ versus time. There we see alpha subjects only, no significant effect. And if we look at now the subscales, the auditory comprehension of the subscale of the crystallized IQ, no effect with time. Double meanings subscale of the crystallized or verbal IQ, no effect of time. And so overall, we see no time-related correlations of change in crystallized IQ as a function of elapsed time. Well, let's do the same analysis with the fluid IQ, which is the mathematical and logical IQ. It's great that the verbal IQ changes of the alpha training, the benefits, did not decay over time. Let's see what happened with the fluid IQ over time. And what we see is the overall fluid IQ had no significant benefits. The changes in fluid IQ had no effect of time, even out to a year after their alpha training. If we look at the subscales like rebus learning, again, no significant effects of time. Logical steps, no significant effect of time. Mystery codes, no correlation with time. And so, in summary, we see that the fluid IQ, which is your mathematical and logical IQ, they had changes with the alpha training, but there were no time-related correlations. No correlation of change in fluid IQ as a function of elapsed time. Wow, that is so wonderful. And so here we see the composite IQ versus change in composite IQ as a function of elapsed time. Alpha subjects only, and not significant. And so the summary is no time-related correlations of the IQ as a function of elapsed time. Now, I cannot tell you, as a scientist, that if you go 10 years out after the alpha training, that there will be no degradation of these IQ boosts, which are apparent from the Biocybernaut alpha training. But we looked from days to weeks to months out to a year later after the training, and we found no effect of the gain in relationship to time. So we're measuring the post-alpha training IQ. The gains were comparable a week, a month, a year later. And so what we see is that this is a benefit, increases in your IQ, composite IQ, but also the subdimensions, the verbal IQ and the mathematical logical IQ, the gains that you get in these from the Biocybernaut alpha training seem to be present even a year later. Now, I don't know if if they degrade after 2 years or 3 years or 10 years, but I do know that out to at least a year, the benefits that you get from the Biocybernaut Alpha training are there the same a year after the training as they are a week after the training. There's no correlation of change in composite IQ as a function of elapsed time. Now, we also want to look at correlations of IQ with pre-IQ. Did smart people increase more or did dumb people increase more? Let's see. So this is the way we're going to do it. We're going to look at the IQ change, pre-alpha IQ in the alpha subjects only. And what we see is in the crystallized IQ versus pre-IQ, that in the alpha subjects, there's no significant effect. If we look at changes in the crystallized IQ definition subscale, there is no significant effect. If you look at the crystallized IQ auditory comprehension, there's no significant effect. If you look at the crystallized IQ double meaning subtest in the alpha subjects, there's no significant effect. And so in summary, we see that the crystallized IQ changes with alpha. There are no pre-alpha IQ related correlations. Now let's pause and consider this. What this tells us is that this alpha training at Biocybernaut boosts your IQ regardless of where you start. The IQ gains are the same for dummies and normals and geniuses. And so in the same way that the alpha training related IQ increases are stable for at least a year after the training, the gains that you can get are the same regardless of what your initial IQ is. There is a sort of a democracy of benefit that exists with the Biocybernaut training, where it doesn't matter if you're dim or bright to start with, you will have the same average increase in your IQ. So there are no correlations of change in the crystallized IQ as a function of your pre-alpha IQ, your starting IQ. Now, changes in IQ, the fluid IQ versus pre-alpha IQ. Again, this is one of the two main dimensions. Fluid is the mathematical logical dimension, and there's no significant effect. So the gain you get is independent of where you started with in your IQ. And so on the subscales, no change, rebus learning, there's no relationship to your starting IQ level. Logical steps, the gain is unrelated to where you started. And mystery codes, the gain is unrelated to where you started. And so the summary of the fluid IQ changes with alpha training is there are no pre-alpha IQ related correlations. No correlations of change in your fluid IQ as a function of your pre-alpha fluid IQ. And so it's really wonderful and remarkable that this training benefits everyone. And you can see here, if we look at the composite IQ with pre to post, no significant changes. And so the summary of the composite IQ changes with alpha training. There are no correlations between pre-IQ and post-IQ. There are changes. There's no correlations of change in the composite IQ as a function of your pre-IQ. The implications are everyone benefits equally. And isn't that wonderful? That there's something that whether you're 10 or 50 or 60 or anywhere in between, this training will boost your IQ the same. And so the discussion and potential questions, we began by checking to see how well matched the alpha trainees were with the control group. And they were extremely well matched. And the patterns of increase were actually quite reasonable. In the crystallized IQ, which is the verbal, there were no vocabulary increases. I would have been surprised if there had been. If you didn't know the meaning of anti-disestablishmentarianism before your alpha training, I would not expect you to know the meaning of anti-disestablishmentarianism after the alpha training. There's nothing about the alpha training that in and of itself is going to get you to know words that you didn't know before. So that's reasonable. But there was improved auditory comprehension as a result of the alpha training. There was better listening, there was more understanding of what people heard, and there was more accurate recall 4 hours after they were retested, and they had more accurate recall afterwards. Discussion and questions. So we had reasonable patterns of IQ increases. In the mathematical logical, there were improved analysis and deduction abilities. There was better analytic ability. There was better reasoning. How important is that? There was better pattern recognition. And there was no elapsed time correlations with IQ. In other words, this tells us that the IQ boosts from 7 days in a Biocybernaut Alpha training chamber, those IQ boosts are stable for at least a year out. We didn't test beyond a year, but they're stable. Those benefits are stable for at least a year out. There's also no chronological age correlations with the IQ boost, meaning that regardless of your age, you're going to benefit from this training in terms of an IQ boost. And there's also no relationship to your pre-IQ score. So this is like one training benefits all. Young people, old people, smart people, dumb people, and the benefits last for at least a year. So pretty good, pretty good. This is an aspect of consciousness. The IQ, intelligence, is one of the aspects of consciousness. And we have a technology and a method to significantly increase your IQ in a way that is stable for at least a year. And it doesn't matter whether what your starting IQ is, you're going to benefit. It doesn't matter your age, you're going to benefit. So the implications with multi-channel EEG feedback training at Biocybernaut, we can beneficially change personality, reduce anxiety, depression, paranoia, schizophrenia, reduce stress-related problems. Multi-channel EEG training, we do deep forgiveness work. We attain powerful and deep meditative states quickly. In Zen, a classic study in Japan done by Kasumatsu and Rai in 1966 showed that it took at least 21 years to attain the brainwaves characteristic of advanced Zen. Whereas at Biocybernaut, you can do it in a week. 21 years versus a week, it's a pretty good deal. There's an increase in creativity that averages 50%. You can boost IQ 11 to 15 percentile points on average. And here are some invitations and opportunities. You can participate in the Alpha 1 training. We have 24 levels of the Alpha training that take you deeper and deeper. There are 24 levels of the advanced Theta trainings, so you can go really deep. And there are 18 levels of the Delta training. Now, Delta trainings are by invitation only because Delta waves confer siddhis or powers. And we want to be sure that you've done enough forgiveness and some ethical cleansing in doing previous Alpha and Theta trainings to be qualified to do Delta trainings at Biocybernaut, because we don't want to create any Darth Vaders who obviously had mind powers. And so we also invite you, if you wish, to volunteer. We'd love to collaborate in research with any of those out there, any of those of you out there who are doing research in related areas. And we would also invite you to join the Biocybernaut team. We're looking for trainers, we're looking for technicians, we're looking for computer programmers, all kinds of job categories. So if you're interested, get in touch and maybe you can join the Biocybernaut team. Thank you for listening. We invite you to contact us with questions. Our main phone in Sedona is 928-203-9000. And our representative, Kate O'Connor, can be reached if you want to register for a training or questions about the trainings. She can be reached at 780-226-2613. She is in Alberta, Canada. And the email is info@biocybernaut.com. Thank you so very much for coming to this talk on a year-long IQ boost from Biocybernaut's 7-day Alpha 1 feedback training program. Thank you very much.